Hello everyone, Dr. Chris Martinson here. Super important question we're answering today. Should you wear a mask? Also, some of the general rules for not getting COVID. We know a lot more than we used to. Come on, let's go find out. Well, hello everyone. This is episode 004 on May 25th, 2021, and we're talking about masks today. So let's get right to it. We're going to answer and address these questions here. First, do they work? Do masks work? Secondarily, when should you wear a mask? Corollary to that is, when do you not need to wear a mask? And finally, should masks be worn in school? We're going to be answering all four of these questions, and we're going to do it how we always do it, with data. We're going to take a look at some data. I love the data. So first, I just want to set the stage here and remind everybody that this is kind of what we were dealing with. This is an article. It's not a bad article, by the way. It came from May of 2020, so a little over a year ago. But this was kind of the tone of things back at the time. This is not. There's some good stuff in this article, but as well, it had a little non-science in there as well. Notice some of the quotes in here. It says. First, the title, "There's no debate, masks save lives." Now, in all circumstances, is there any nuance to this? When should we, when shouldn't we? Truthfully, we know a lot more now than we did just a year ago. But you'd think that when it comes to something like a pandemic, that maybe your health authorities, like the CDC, the FDA, somebody would spend a little bit of time studying this issue and spending some money on it. That might be a really cool thing. But it turns out, you'll be surprised, data's a little weak here still. So he begins by saying there's no debate, masks save lives. And then look at a couple of the quotes on there. All respected public health authorities or bodies now recommend masks, particularly when distancing is impossible. Just look at the framing of that. All respected. I guess the disrespected ones might recommend something different, but all the respected ones absolutely recommend masks, particularly when distancing is impossible. Secondarily, another quote from there, masks represent a simple and effective strategy whose use will save tens of thousands of lives. So a lot of very declarative statements. We're trying to find out, is this true or not? What was interesting to this, I just want to raise this because when we talk about the other things that we're not allowed to talk about, Disperse 1 and 2, which are the drugs which shall not be named, just a national tragedy there, maybe even crime of the century, as Brett Weinstein put it, that we can't talk about these things openly. But this is interesting because in this article it noted here, this is from our author Greenhall, there at a British Medicine Journal. Says here, in conclusion, talking about masks here, in the face of the pandemic, the search for perfect evidence may be the enemy of good policy. Well, think about if you heard those words around Disperse 1 and 2, right? As with parachutes for jumping out of aeroplanes, it is time to act without waiting for randomized controlled trial evidence. Oh, it's time to act without waiting for randomized controlled trial evidence. A recently posted preprint of a systemic review came to the same conclusion. Masks are simple, cheap, and potentially effective. Imagine if those words were written about Disperse 1 or Disperse 2, right? This is official policy. When the government of the UK wanted you to wear masks in the UK, they rested on this. Like, hey, we don't have time for RCTs, randomized controlled trials. We don't know that. So let's just go ahead with the best evidence we have. What harm could befall? When something is very safe and you think it might do good, it's reasonable policy, right? Just not when it comes to Disperse 1 or 2, which might compete with a major pharma drug. Just a tragedy in that story. So here's the data we have. A lot of people know about this. I hear about it all the time. We call it the Danish Study. So printed up in the Annals of Internal Medicine. They did a study in Denmark, and the title here, Effectiveness of Adding a Mask Recommendation to Other Public Health Measures, those NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, to prevent SARS-CoV-2 infection in Danish mask wearers. Now, this study was done way back in 2020. It's in the March 2021 issue, so it took a little time to get this into print. But looking at how they did this is kind of interesting. What they did here, the intervention, the study design, was encouragement to follow social distancing, great. Measures for coronavirus disease 2019, plus either no mask recommendation for a person, or a recommendation to wear a mask when outside the home among other persons, together with a supply of 50 surgical masks and instructions on proper use. So 2 groups of people, they both were given the same instructions, but one group around social distancing, but one group was given masks. All right, what did they find out? So they had a total of 3,030 participants were randomly assigned to the recommendation to wear masks, and 2,994 assigned to control. 4,862 completed the study. Now, this is interesting. Infection with SARS-CoV-2 occurred in 42 participants, recommended masks, so that was 1.8% overall, and 53 control participants, which is 2.1%. 1.8, 2.1, there's really no big difference between those two numbers. So the conclusion from this was, hey, wearing masks outside doesn't really seem to do a lot. So the between group percentage was just minus 0.3 percentage points, which wasn't really p-value of 0.38, not statistically significant. So that's what they came up with. And a couple of interesting things, though, a few limitations in this study before we get too excited about it. First, look what this is. April and May this happened in 2020. Look at the number of cases. They only had a couple hundred cases per day showing up at max back there in that study period. So the incidence of the disease was really low. So your chance of bumping into somebody out in the street who might have had it was also low. So this wasn't a really robust study from that standpoint. Best they could do at the time. They just didn't have a very high incidence population to work from. So we note that very low incidence, one of the limitations of this Danish study before we put too much stock in it. A second one was they had very low mask wearing and adherence generally in the population at the time out there. So this is really a one-way study. The people who are out wearing masks would have been preventing other people from getting sick from their own sickness more than they would have been prevented from other people infecting them, because the mask does more to stop it on the way out, surgical masks like they were giving them, than to stop it on the way in. So not imperfect, but it's another limitation. And also, finally, mask wearing at home was not part of the deal. And home infection is actually a huge confounder, because that's where the majority of infections actually happen. So how do you really parse through the study and you find out, hey, your mask wearers outside versus non-mask wearers outside, they got sick at about the same rate, is actually what we would expect, knowing what we know now about CoV-2 and how it affects people. All right, so a lot of people say the Danish study proved that masks don't work, but I don't think it really did that for these reasons right here. Low incidence, it was sort of a one-way test, and there weren't that many people wearing masks anyway, and nobody in the study wore them at home. All right, so fortunately, there's other data out there we can turn to look at this a little bit more deeply. So let's see, where am I going here now? So we had these BLM protests. Remember, it was, I believe, May 25th, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And then there were all these protests that erupted after that. So May and June, back when the infection was really raging all over the United States, there were a lot of people out in the streets, right? And so they actually did a study of this, and they looked at both places where a lot of protests or riots, depending on what you call them, where those happened, and compared those to control counties that were nearby where there wasn't, those sorts of gatherings of people. And so what they found was that in the 22 days after the killing of George Floyd, there were 326 counties participating in 868 protests. So this is a really big, giant data set. It's really big. Attended by an estimated 750,000+ protesters. So we have 750,000 people participating in this study. And the median case rate at week 3 was 0.0049 in protest counties versus 0.0041 in the control counties, which means there was no statistically significant finding. So even though there were all these people protesting, there really was no outdoor spread. There wasn't any spread, really. Nothing statistically significant. Slight uptick, 0.0049 versus 0.0041. Pretty slight. All right, you remember, so here's a couple pictures. Remember, there were a lot of, this is a BLM protest. What can we note looking at this picture here? Well, we can note a couple of things. A lot of people not wearing face masks at all. People are fairly densely packed together. And there was probably a lot of shouting and other things that we know now are very good at helping to spread SARS-CoV-2. And still, out of 750,000 participants, the study said, we didn't really see a lot of spread. Where if this stuff was really spreading well and easy outside, you would say, well, this is an ideal environment right here, or this one, right? This is very typical scenes. We saw some pictures from back then with a lot of mask wearing, many without, because it wasn't really fully enmeshed in the culture at that point in time. It was a little more optional than it is today here in a year later. So at any rate, that observation says that alone, that's what we would call epidemiological or observational data, where we're looking across a large population of people during a very critical event, and we didn't see any super spreaders. There wasn't a lot of spreading going on outside. So what kind of conclusion can you draw from that? Well, given that a lot of these people weren't wearing masks, probably masks aren't all that necessary outside. Are you sure about that, Chris? Let's get some data to go with that. So there was another study they did, which is they did this in Marine recruits. This is the Marine study, and they were looking at SARS-CoV-2 transmission. And so what did they do here? They investigated this SARS-CoV-2 infection among U.S. Marine Corps recruits. So these are pretty young, healthy individuals who underwent a 2-week quarantine at home, followed by a second supervised 2-week quarantine at a closed college campus that involved mask wearing, social distancing, and daily temperature and symptom monitoring. Study volunteers were tested for SARS-CoV-2 by means of quantitative polymerase chain reaction, or PCR assay, of Nere's swab specimens obtained between the time of arrival and the second day of supervised quarantine, and on days 7 and days 14. Recruits who did not volunteer for the study underwent PCR testing on day 14 at the end of the quarantine period. So, 2 groups. One group getting obviously the social distancing, the hand washing, and the masks, and they're wearing the mask both outside and inside. So this is a little bit better now. We're tightening this up. We're trying to find out if there's any sort of a difference here. What did they find? Well, a lot of good study numbers here. A total of 1,848 recruits volunteered to participate in the study within 2 days after arrival on campus, and 16 or 0.9% tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, 15 of whom were asymptomatic. So that's kind of what you get with the younger people, right? They're like, yeah, they got a detectable SARS-CoV-2 with a PCR test. Who knows? Maybe with 35, 40 cycle thresholds, we don't know. But they could detect it, but 15 out of 16 were asymptomatic, very typical of young people. An additional 35 participants, or 1.9%, tested positive on day 7 or on day 14. 5 of the 51 participants, or around 10%, that's 9.8%, who tested positive at the time had symptoms in the week before a positive PCR test. So again, very few people are actually showing any symptoms at all, around 10%. Of the recruits who declined to participate in the study, 26 or 1.7% of them with available PCR results tested positive on day 14. So now we're comparing on day 14 to compare apples to apples, 1.7% compared to 1.9%. No difference at all between the two of them. All right. And so they did note here the epidemiologic analysis supported multiple local transmission events, including transmission between roommates and among recruits within the same platoon. So now we're starting to hone in on this thing. Masks didn't make a difference here either. About the same level of attack rate or infectivity rate, positivity rate. So masks didn't really help. So what can we conclude from this? Fortunately, Dr. Pierre Corey over at the FLCCC wrote a beautiful review article about this. There's the link at the bottom. Again, all the links for all of these studies always included. You can find them all at the bottom here. Also included in the notes at the bottom of this that accompany this at YouTube, but always at Peak Prosperity, the website, where we have a deeper, richer conversation around things like this, including this episode. You can find all the links there, as well as all the conversations we're going to have, because there's a lot more data I couldn't include in this today that is really important to this conversation. All right, so he summarized masks and the incidence of SARS-CoV-2 infection. What are the parameters? What are the variables here? There are 4 of them. They go by the 4 Ds. Density. How many people do you have in a room? That's really important. The duration. How long? How many minutes? How many hours? How long were you in contact with these other people, some of whom presumably are sick? The dimensions, that's the square feet of the room, and also the height. We want to know how many cubic feet of volume are in there. And then finally, the draft. It's the amount of fresh air or entry or the airspeed or flow. How much turnover that room's air are you getting on a per hour basis? So those 4 Ds, the density, duration, dimensions, draft, those are really the defining parameters. So you want to control those if you don't want to get sick. So he says here, if you violate any of the 4 Ds above in a significant way, you run the risk of getting sick, even with a standard mask. The military recruit study, for instance, that we just went over, showed that in the group wearing masks, nearly all transmission occurred between roommates or within platoons. And it should be noted that these situations violate all of the 4 Ds above, all of them. They spent time indoors among a high density of recruits for prolonged durations in small dimensioned rooms with likely very little draft. Standard cloth or surgical masks just won't offer sufficient protection in these settings if an infected person is in their midst. So that's it. So if you want to know how not to get sick, very simply just keep these 4 Ds in mind. So however you want to remember those, just density, duration, dimensions, draft. So just keep those in mind, and you'll be safer if you can maximize each one of these or limit these parameters depending on what they are. All right, what other data we got? Well, we have this study that came out and said virus particles disperse very quickly. I love this right in the front sentence of this thing. It can be shown that over 94% of COVID-19 super spreading events occurred in limited ventilation areas, suggesting aerosolized transmission is a strong contributor to COVID-19 infections. Remember, we were talking about COVID being aerosolized literally in February of 2020. It was probably just a couple months ago that the WHO finally admitted that. It was so obvious from the data, and it's so obvious from the mask data that we're covering here right now, that this is an aerosolized substance. That's how it's small droplets. That's how it's spreading. And we have a lot more data to confirm that right now, but the indoor versus outdoor data really confirms this. So in an aerosolized thing, those things spread and dilute very, very, very rapidly. So let's go to some data around this because it's really cool what this can show. This study finally gave me some numbers. Remember we talked about mask wearing and inoculum, the loading dose, the initial dose you get, how many virus particles you get, determine whether you're going to have no illness, mild illness, or very severe illness. Well, they quantified this, comparing it to known quantities for influenza. Is it the same? Don't know. Good starting point, though. Really cool. So 10 to the third, that means 1,000. So if you got 1,000 virus particles as a loading dose, they would say here, you're not going to get ill. Or the majority of people are going to have no symptoms. There's going to be no shedding. So you get 1,000 of these virus particles in you. Nothing really happens. Well, what happens if you get 10 to the fourth? So we're getting 10,000 virus particles. Well, now you're going to experience minor illness, and maybe, about half of people are going to get symptoms. Still really no shedding, though, so you're not really going to be transmissive. You're getting enough of a dose that you feel it, but you're not enough that it overwhelms your system and you're now shedding it out to the rest of the world. But then we bump it up. We get ourselves up to 100,000 particles. Well, now you're going to get minor illness. Majority of people are going to get symptoms, and there is now some shedding. So this is the concept of the viral load. 1,000 particles, no big deal. 10,000, maybe a minor illness. Hey, you might actually develop an inoculum to that on your own where you start to get some sort of level of immunity. 100,000 particles, okay, now you might actually get up to the shedding, and when you get 1 million or more particles, possible severe illness. So this is the inoculum or the dose effect. Like this paper for that. So I like this because they also gave us a time quantity. So we have an amount, and it's an amount over time. So those factor into the 4 Ds. So a person wearing a mask doing light work, okay, wearing a surgical mask in a 6-patient room may encounter enough exposure to develop a minor illness in a 49-minute period. So, geez, almost 50 minutes, 49 minutes, you might get a minor illness. So it's all the way back down here at 10 to the fourth. Maybe you might get exposed to like 10,000 virus particles over 49 minutes, right? But would likely not develop mild illness or flu-like symptoms unless in that environment for over 8 hours. So it takes really sustained contact. This fits with the data we saw where half of the members of a household would get sick, the other half wouldn't get sick, right? How is that possible? We've got this super contagious virus, people living in a house, and still they're not getting all that sick. Well, this is the data that's kind of supporting that and telling us why that is. So this is really cool. I liked down here, there was actually a really cool thing. It's possible that by rotating medical staff work through COVID-19 patient areas at exposure intervals below the low end of this range, several days apart, and monitoring antibody test levels could help provide a path to immunity and increased ability to work with increasing exposure level environments without illness. Natural immunity. You do it through low doses. I suggested this a year ago where I said, and I was a really wackadoodle idea, really, some of you didn't like it, but I said, hey, maybe one way we get through this illness faster is we give healthy people really low doses of this virus so that they have a low inoculum, so they experience enough of a challenge by that virus so that they develop an immune response, but not enough of a challenge so that they get overwhelmed and sick with possible complications. This study supporting that idea, and because it's supporting something I said, I kind of like it. Sounds good. Hey, continuing on, in the Irish Times, we saw here the outdoor transmission of COVID. Outdoor transmission accounts for just 0.1% of the state's COVID cases. So they did this big study. They looked at where all the contact tracing they did. They asked the question, where did people catch COVID? And the answer was overwhelmingly not outdoors. Just 0.1% of cases were outdoors. And then moving on, we see here super low outdoor transmission. Here's a tweet by Monica Gandhi here. I think, yeah, I had talked about masks. She's a really good person on masks. Originally, when I was talking about masks, she came up before. A study in Wuhan, China, which involved very careful contact tracing, discovered that just 1 out of 7,324 infection events investigated was linked to outdoor transmission. None of the outbreaks identified were from outside transmission. So just they did 7,334 breakout events, little mini clusters, and asked the question, where'd that come from? Only one of those was linked to outdoors. So there's some more confirmation. Where's the CDC on this? They're busy damaging themselves again. This is just from May 11th. The headline here reads, CDC grossly exaggerating outdoor transmission rate. They got roundly slapped by, I even saw a New York Times article that said boo to this. The CDC is greatly exaggerating the risk of COVID-19 transmission outdoors, claiming there is a roughly 10% chance of getting it outdoors, when in reality, the figure's less than 1%. The higher federal figure seems to be a huge exaggeration, says Dr. Muj Savic here, top infectious disease doctor at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Try 0.1%. So off by a factor of 100? Remember, when we were talking about the rates of serious adverse events, particular anaphylactic shock, the numbers that we saw comparing the Brigham Hospital actual results from the shots, we saw that they had a rate that was about 120 times higher than what the CDC was reporting as an anaphylactic risk. Remember, it was a difference between just 2.4 per million and 250 or 60 per million, which is the real world data. So the CDC, just off by a lot. And why is that bad to say, we think a maximum of 10% of cases are coming from outdoors? I mean, that means 90% aren't. So the reason that's so bad is because it's a huge gross exaggeration. It's I believe in the New York Times article, they had a great, there was a metaphor around this. They said, that's like saying less than 20,000 people a year die from shark attacks, when the actual number is 150. Technically true, It's technically true is the best kind of true usually, but in this case, you want to be a lot more accurate. 0.1% of cases actually come outdoors. So, a couple of conclusions from that. The first, classrooms, we're doing it wrong. Look at all these kids sitting here. This is a French classroom. It could look like a U.S. classroom or any other place. They're all sitting there. They got their masks on. A, kids are really not at risk from COVID at all. B, masks indoors like these don't really work. That's what the Marine study says. C, what else could you do? I don't know. You could get the kids to go outside like we used to do it. This would be, I think, how they would have done it in 1918. Like the high-tech solution is we're going to have to put better ventilators in the classrooms. We're going to have to get the kids better lucite enclosures, and we'll give them better masks. No, how about we just take them outside? That would be, I think, hugely beneficial. We might even discover people learn better outside. It would be awesome. So that would be my solution. Quick and easy, and it might work. It also means there's no need for this. You don't need to be wearing your mask all alone in your car unless you want to virtue signal something, because there's really no benefit at all. I guess maybe if you're an Uber driver and you're just about to pick somebody up, that could be an explanation for this. But otherwise, this doesn't do any good for anybody. Doesn't really help. Neither does this. Being outside, running with a mask, being even anywhere outside. Right now, we can say pretty definitively this. These conclusions. First, don't bother wearing a mask when you're outside. You don't need to. I mean, if you want to and it makes you feel better, go for it. But there's no science to support the idea that A, COVID passes easily outside, or B, wearing a mask outside is going to take that already tiny percentage and make it any better for you. Okay? You can feel safe outside because you are safe outside. That's my personal stance. I feel completely safe outside or even in a very well-ventilated area. Maybe wear one in a crowd, yeah, but even then, there's not much data to suggest that spread happens outdoors under any circumstances. We just don't have any evidence for that yet. If there is data, if there's science, I'd love to see it. Be sure to bring it to me and I'll talk about it. Just if you want to be safe from COVID, just remember these 4 Ds, right? You got your distance and duration, you got the density, and you got the draft. So you just want to keep your distance from people just a little bit, because remember, these things are aerosolized or floating around. If you need 10,000 or more particles, the distance spreads this with the cube of the volume, right? So they fall off very rapidly across distance in a volume. And then the duration, how long are you actually in contact? It takes quite a bit of time. So if you've been around somebody and they were near you and they looked a little sick maybe, and you had a few feet between you, I wouldn't worry about it. You're probably going to be fine. Then the density, how many people do you have packed in a spot? Obviously a lot of people, like, the super spreader events were like people packed together singing in churches. That seemed to be particularly effective at spreading the disease. In draft, if you've got a lot of air circulation area, again, you're going to be safer than if that's not the case. Cool thing that comes out of this, the review here, glad to have done this with you today. The dose matters, how much you get. So now we have some quantification around that. That's good to know. It goes by units of 10, from you're not going to get it at all to you're probably going to get a pretty severe illness, from 1,000 copies of the virus to 1 million, going through those steps of 10. All right, so that's what we have there today. I'm going to tell you, if you like science and you like conversations like this, you want to learn more about this subject, and you want to talk about how you can stay safe from COVID and whether or not you need to wear a mask. Come by Peak Prosperity. We're having great conversations there every single day. A lot of data-rich conversations. And as a final word, I just want to leave you with this message. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Honey Badger Farms. As we swivel around, I'm going to introduce you to my soil management experts over here. They're helping us, Evie and myself, produce better soil out here in the field. Something I think it's really, really critical is learning how to garden, to be able to grow our own food. And I want you to consider coming this June 25th and 26th to Polyface Farms in Virginia. Joel Salatin's amazing place for a couple days of learning, all about running a successful farming operation, small garden, homestead, whatever you got. I'm going to be there, and so are a bunch of other key influencers at Peak Prosperity, big tribe assembling. So consider coming if you would. If you're interested, click this link right here or the one down below in the description. I hope to see you there. It's going to be a fantastic time. See you then.